Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm going to cover some of the criminal organizations in the city of Vancouver, BC. And this is part 3 of a 3-part series, so if you get some value out of this one, you might enjoy parts 1 and 2 that I've already posted. And as a quick note before I get started, all information in this video is based on publicly available information, and this is intended to be a general overview of the gang situation in Vancouver. And in this video, I'm going to start with one of the most notorious criminal groups from Vancouver's history, and that was the Satan's Angels Motorcycle Club. The Satan's Angels Motorcycle Club were formed in the 1960s, and like many other clubs, they didn't start out with the express intent of committing crimes. But over time, many of their members were involved in high-profile violent events, and they quickly developed a fearsome reputation in Vancouver. In December of 1967, 2 Satan's Angels members were jailed for viciously assaulting a 20-year-old outside a club in Vancouver. In January of 1968, former Calgary oil man Sidney McDonald, who was working as a promoter in Vancouver, was brutally beat to death at a Satan's Angels clubhouse. There's actually a very thoughtful article written about this by Sidney McDonald's daughter, which was written many years later. And then in February of 1968, a 20-year-old man named James Cannon got into a conflict with a Satan's Angels member at Jerry's Cafe on Davie Street, and he was later kidnapped and tortured by several Satan's Angels members at a clubhouse. That day, members of the club initially set out to intentionally antagonize hippies, and they had a reputation of bullying innocent people, especially soft hippie types and members of Vancouver's counterculture. Over time, the club allegedly became involved in everything from drug dealing to gambling and prostitution, but they denied being a criminal organization. This group was also known to display Nazi imagery and symbols in their clubhouses. And here's a quote from high-ranking member David Black, taken from a 1977 Vancouver Sun article. Quote, "There are definite spirits, and we identify with that particular one which has been called Satan. It's an upside-down world. Our virtues are others' vices. You could say we're Satanists." The club became known around Vancouver for their long funeral processions of hundreds of bikers when a member died. And throughout the 1960s and 1970s, they were the dominant outlaw motorcycle club in BC. But things started to change in the 1980s. Another motorcycle club was expanding west from Eastern Canada, and that was the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. This group was initially founded as a riding club in the late 1940s in California, and it was made up largely of World War II veterans. And they eventually became the largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world. What started as a riding club turned into what most law enforcement and intelligence agencies would consider a sophisticated criminal organization. In fact, the Hells Angels are considered one of the major criminal organizations in Canada, and they definitely have a longer history in Eastern Canada, particularly in Montreal, which is considered to be Canada's crime headquarters. And after establishing a base in Eastern Canada, this club started expanding to the west. In 1983, the Satan's Angels, who were the main motorcycle club in that province, patched over to the Hells Angels, who established 3 charters in BC that year: Vancouver, Nanaimo, and White Rock. A 4th Hells Angels charter was opened in East Vancouver that year, and this would become the club's leading charter in BC. And by the mid-1980s, the Hells Angels had gained control of outlaw motorcycle clubs in that province. And shortly after establishing themselves in BC, the Hells Angels quickly found themselves involved in high-profile events in the Lower Mainland. On April 6 of 1988, full patch member David Swartz of the East Vancouver charter was shot and killed by his friend Lynn Eddington, who then killed himself. Shortly before the start of Eddington's funeral on April 10th, 3 Hells Angels members entered the Valley View funeral home and cursed and spit on the coffin. And Lynn Eddington's mother, Jean, claimed that she received a threatening voicemail. The Hells Angels would deny leaving the voicemail, but they admitted to spitting on the coffin, and this was a very highly publicized event in Vancouver at the time. In May of 1990, West Vancouver stockbroker Ray Giannetti was shot to death, and he was believed to be an associate of the Hells Angels. Giannetti's death was thought to be caused by a group known as the Russians, or the Russians Gang. Their exact connections to the greater Russian mob was unclear, but this group was made up of Soviet expatriates who were attempting to move into the drug trade in Vancouver. And Ray Giannetti's death in 1990 was a brazen example of violence between the Russians and the Hells Angels. Just 6 days after Ray Giannetti's death, Russian gang member Sergei Filinov was gunned down in the middle of the day at the popular Trev Dealey motorcycle store on West Broadway. 2 men associated with the Hells Angels surrendered within hours of the shooting, claiming self-defense. A couple years later in 1992, Sergei Filinov's brother Taras was kidnapped and his body was found dead on the UBC campus. The next year, in November of 1993, a car bomb detonated under the popular Broadway Earl's restaurant. This was meant to kill Russians' gang members and brothers Alexander and Eugenie Alexeyev. Shortly after this bomb, another vehicle belonging to Alexander Alexeyev was blown up, and the bomb detonated as he approached his vehicle, and pieces were blown over a block away. The Russians' gang declined in prominence over time, but the Angels remained strong in the Vancouver area. By the mid-90s, the club had expanded and had charters across BC. In the mid-90s, Vancouver police stated that the Hells Angels had smaller puppet clubs that were working for them, including the EastEnders Motorcycle Club, who were affiliated with the Hells Angels East Vancouver charter, and a group called the Tribesmen, who were said to be working for the larger club. The Hells Angels grew in influence and wealth into the new millennium, and their East Vancouver charter was considered to be not only the most powerful charter in Western Canada, but one of the wealthiest charters in the world. There was a best-selling book published in 2011 by journalist Neil Hall entitled Hell to Pay, which chronicles the story of police informer Michael Plant, who infiltrated the Hells Angels in the early 2000s. So Michael Plant was becoming involved with the Hells Angels, and in 2003 he was assigned to take part in a murder, and this really didn't sit well with him, and he decided to turn against the club and become a police informer for the RCMP. Michael Plant became an agent source informer, and he was paid $14,000 a month in exchange for wearing a wire and gathering information. In addition to these payments, Plant also received free vacations to Mexico, a '97 Mustang, a brand new Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and paid meals at a restaurant where the tab often ran up to $2,000 per meal. These generous payments led the media to later dub Michael Plant the $1 Million Rat. This undercover operation was called Project E Pandora, with the police surveilling the club and Michael Plant wearing a wire and acting as an informer. A ton of evidence was gathered during this operation, but it came to an end in January 2005 when Plant testified that he could no longer handle the stress of being an informer, and he formally quit and went into hiding in another city. In July of 2005, the RCMP would storm the clubhouse of the Hells Angels East End charter, and during their raids over the following days, they seized $7 million worth of illegal goods. Many members of the club were arrested, charged, and convicted of various crimes, and at the time, this amount of charges against a criminal organization was unprecedented in BC, and it was a major hit to the club, who had been relatively lucky up to that point in terms of escaping prosecution in the province. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I would definitely recommend the book Hell to Pay for an in-depth look at this undercover operation and the aftermath. The Angels were involved in the 2009 Vancouver gang war, which I covered briefly in the Part 1 video, but they mainly stayed behind the scenes and supplied smaller gangs and got them to do the dirty work. They have been affiliated with many smaller outlaw motorcycle clubs, and police say that these smaller groups are often puppet clubs of the Hells Angels. These groups include the Los Diablos Motorcycle Club, who are active across the province. The Jesters Motorcycle Club are based in Surrey, and they have also been linked with the Hells Angels. And another group in Surrey associated with the Hells Angels are the Shadow Club, who also have a clubhouse in that city. As the Angels were forming alliances throughout the 2010s, they were facing a big problem. The BC government was taking significant action to seize their clubhouses across the province. These government actions were highly publicized, and the court cases wouldn't be resolved until well into the 2020s. 3 Hells Angels clubhouses in BC would eventually be seized in 2023, including one in Vancouver, and they are set to be sold off. The Hells Angels would continue forming alliances with smaller puppet clubs into the 2020s. Staff Sergeant Lindsay Houghton of the Anti-Gang Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit stated in 2022 that there were about 30 support or puppet clubs of the Hells Angels in BC. Some groups identified were the Sinful Kings, the Crushers Riding Club, the Sinister Riding Club, and the Silverback Gorillas Riding Club. Even though they have had multiple clubhouses seized recently, the Hells Angels remain the dominant motorcycle club in BC with many alliances with smaller groups, and they are considered by police to be one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Vancouver. And then in 2010, a new criminal organization called the Wolfpack Alliance was formed by full-patch Hells Angels member Larry Amaro. Other initial leaders of this group were Jonathan Bacon of the Red Scorpions, as well as Randy Naker and James Rioch of the Independent Soldiers. Initially, the Wolfpack Alliance largely worked for the Sinaloa cartel of Mexico, where they smuggled and distributed cocaine. Even though this group was formed in Vancouver, they quickly spread across Canada and became a national group. Obviously, another major port city in Canada is Montreal, and the Wolfpack quickly set up shop in that city, where they established a smuggling ring bringing cocaine into Canada from the US. I mentioned in part 1 that prominent Vancouver gangster Gurmeet Dak was murdered in a highly publicized shooting in 2010 during that prolonged state of gang violence in that city. Gurmeet's brother Suk Dak believed that the Wolfpack Alliance was responsible for his brother's murder, and he hired a team of 4 hitmen to hunt down the Wolfpack. On August 14th of 2011, prominent Wolfpack leader Jonathan Bacon was murdered in Kelowna in a shooting that would also injure Wolfpack founder Larry Amaro. The United Nations gang, which I mentioned in the part 1 video, would later ally with the Dak Doer group against this new Wolfpack Alliance. 2012 had many high-profile events. On January 16th of that year, a United Nations gang member was murdered in Mexico. The very next day, on January 17th, Sandeep Doer, who was co-boss of the Dak Doer group, was murdered in Vancouver. And then a day after that, on January 18th, United Nations leader Thomas Gisby was almost killed when his mobile home was bombed in Whistler. He then fled to Mexico, where he was eventually murdered on April 28th. On June 25th of that year, Wolfpack leader Randy Naker was shot dead in Port Moody. And on November 19th of that year, Suk Dak and his bodyguard Thomas Mantell were murdered in retaliation. Between 2010 and 2013, there were 20 murders overall in the Lower Mainland related to the gang war started by the murder of Gurmeet Dak. The group was initially used by the Sinaloa cartel to establish a drug distribution network in Canada, but by early 2014, the cartel had effectively cut out the Wolfpack and started distributing cocaine themselves. The Wolfpack still established their own profitable activities, and according to police, they've even expanded beyond Canada. There's a crime correspondent with the Toronto Star named Peter Edwards, and he wrote about how the Wolfpack was largely using the internet to communicate with each other and organize their activities. Quote, "They're bonded by the internet, not geography. Some are in Vancouver, some are in Montreal, some are in Toronto, and it doesn't really matter. They can move around. With the Wolfpack, there isn't a place, there's just a shared feeling or need for the internet." There is an excellent book entitled The Wolfpack, The Millennial Mobsters Who Brought Chaos and the Cartels to the Canadian Underworld. It's written by award-winning Mexican journalist Luis Najera and organized crime author Peter Edwards, who I previously mentioned. And it's just a fascinating read if you're interested in learning more about this group. And according to police, the Wolfpack is still very active in Vancouver, and they have a significant controlling influence over the downtown east side drug trade. In my Gangs of Vancouver Part 1 video, I mentioned prominent gang families such as the Bacon brothers and the Doer brothers of the Dak Doer group. And when you're talking about prominent crime families in Vancouver, you have to mention the Alkhalil family. This family was originally from the Palestinian Mandate in modern-day Israel, and they fled to Lebanon during the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948 to 1949. They then moved to Saudi Arabia, where the 5 Alkhalil brothers were born: Nabil, Khalil, Hisham, Mahmoud, and Rabi. Because the family were Palestinian refugees, they were denied the right to become Saudi citizens, and in December of 1990, the family immigrated to Canada as refugees, settling in Surrey, BC. As the 5 Alkhalil brothers grew up, they eventually became involved in criminal activity. In May of 2000, Nabil stabbed a Doer gang member at a park in Surrey, and this started a long-standing feud with the Doer brothers. The first Alkhalil brother to be murdered was Khalil. He was found dead on January 18th of 2001 with 6 shots in his body. A drug dealer named Michael Nod, who was working for the Dak Doer group, would be charged with this murder. When Michael Nod posted bail on February 3rd of 2001, 30 members of the Alkhalil family showed up at the courtroom in New Westminster and antagonized the Nod family. They also shouted at the judge and crown attorney when Nod was granted bail, and they followed his family outside and assaulted their lawyer Philip Rankin. In the months following, the Nod family faced significant harassment with shots fired into their home, and their lawyer Philip Rankin was repeatedly assaulted by Mahmoud Alkhalil. At Michael Nod's trial, he testified that he was acting in self-defense, that Khalil was robbing him at gunpoint, and that he managed to wrestle the gun away and kill Khalil out of self-defense. On November 7th of 2002, Michael Nod was acquitted of his charges by the jury, which greatly angered the Alkhalil family. On April 11th of 2003, Michael Nod's father Raymond was shot and wounded inside his own home. And on July 5th of 2004, Michael Nod was shot to death in Kelowna. Mahmoud Alkhalil eventually became a member of the Independent Soldiers Gang. On August 16th of 2003, he was shot during a shootout with the Hells Angels at the Loft 6 nightclub in Gastown. He managed to drive away from the scene but died of blood loss in his car a couple blocks away, and he was only 19 at the time. Brothers Nabil and Hisham Alkhalil became very active in criminal activity in Ottawa. Nabil eventually ended up in Mexico, where he was murdered in 2018. And then finally, Rabi Alkhalil, who I briefly mentioned in the Part 1 video, ended up relocating to Montreal and became a leader of the Wolfpack Alliance. Rabi Alkhalil and Larry Amaro initially planned on using their connections in the Montreal underworld to gain access to the New York drug market. Rabi was involved in many crimes in eastern Canada while based in Montreal, but he was also involved in the murder of Sandeep Doer in 2012. On January 17th of that year, Sandeep was shot and killed in Vancouver, and it was alleged that Rabi Alkhalil and Larry Amaro ordered a hitman to kill him. Rabi would end up behind bars and on trial for this murder in Vancouver in 2021, but on July 21st of 2022, Rabi escaped from the North Fraser Pretrial Center jail. Shortly after his escape, a senior RCMP officer stated that Rabi had probably left Canada within an hour of his escape, and it is likely that he will never be found. Rabi would be convicted of the murder in his absence, and he remains at large. On October 18th of 2022, the RCMP declared Rabi Alkhalil to be Canada's most wanted man and offered a $250,000 reward for information on his whereabouts. And so over time, the Alkhalil family definitely established themselves as one of the most notorious crime families in BC's history. There's another group that formed in the Lower Mainland called the 856 Gang. They first emerged as a youth gang in Aldergrove in 2003, and the name 856 comes from the area's telephone prefix. Initially, the 856 Gang was denounced as punks by the RCMP, but they quickly became a legitimate criminal organization and a multi-ethnic gang. In September of 2007, they were involved in the shooting of Hells Angels associate Leonard Peltier in Langley, and 6 core members of the gang were arrested by RCMP after this incident. But in the years that followed the shooting, they actually formed ties with the Hells Angels and became a sort of puppet club. They eventually expanded to northern BC, Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. In 2014, the RCMP arrested 3 high-ranking members of this gang and seized $400,000 worth of drugs from a residence in Langley. The 856 Gang had been working with the Hells Angels, but in 2016, 856 member Jason Wallace shot and killed Hells Angels member Bob Green at a party. An associate of the 856 Gang named Sean Clary was murdered and dismembered in retaliation. Since the murder of Hells Angels Bob Green, the 856 Gang has been at odds with that larger club, and they've been on the decline, although they're still active in BC and the Northwest Territories. Obviously, Indo-Canadian groups make up much of Vancouver's gang landscape, as I covered in my Part 1 video. And then a relatively new gang that showed up on police radar in 2017 is the Brothers Keepers Gang, and this was founded by Govinder Grewal. This group became successful in the dial-a-dope operations that had become common in the Vancouver area. Not long after Vancouver police learned about this group, the gang had a split within their ranks, which spawned the creation of another gang. In October of 2017, a former member of the Brothers Keepers Gang named Randy Kang was murdered in Surrey, and this was thought to have been committed by the gang. A couple months later, in December of that year, Brothers Keepers founder Gavin Grewal was murdered, and police say that this was in retaliation for Randy Kang's murder. And pretty soon, the Kang Crime Group was officially formed, and they were in frequent conflict with the Brothers Keepers. The Kang Group was initially allied with the Red Scorpions Gang, who I covered in the Part 1 video, and they would be involved in frequent conflict with the Brothers Keepers and the United Nations Gang for control of the Lower Mainland's drug trade. In 2018, Vancouver police had a major investigation into the Kang Group and their Red Scorpions associates, dubbed Project Territory. This operation resulted in 11 people connected to the Kang Group pleading guilty to a variety of charges. Gary Kang, who is a prominent leader in the group, would be murdered in January of 2021 in Surrey. He was killed by a rapper and Brothers Keepers associate that goes by the rapper named T-Sav. A Supreme Court judge stated that one of his songs was essentially a thinly veiled confession to Randy Kang's murder, and he would eventually receive 2 life sentences for the murder of Randy Kang and Jagveer Mali. Shortly after Randy Kang was murdered in January of 2021, Brothers Keepers member Harb Dhaliwal was shot to death, and this just continued the conflict between the 2 groups. The Kang Group is mainly active in the Lower Mainland of BC, but the Brothers Keepers started to establish themselves in Alberta and Ontario. Over time, the Brothers Keepers found themselves in a serious conflict with the United Nations Gang. Just last year, on November 8th of 2023, United United Nations member Parmveer Chahil from BC was shot to death in Toronto, and this was thought to be connected to the Brothers Keepers. The very next day, on November 9th, in Edmonton, Alberta, Brothers Keepers member Harpreet Upal and his 11-year-old son were gunned down at a gas station. And this was obviously a horrific escalation in the conflict, and it's very rare that a family member is killed in a gang conflict in Canada. The Brothers Keepers are still very active, with high-profile stories involving the group this year in 2024. In April of this year, Brothers Keepers member Amandeep Kang was sentenced to 11 years on drug trafficking charges, and a month earlier, Brothers Keepers member Jagraj Atwal was shot at by 2 assailants on a busy downtown Vancouver street. Police described them as an extremely violent organized crime group, and they are definitely one of the prominent modern gangs of Vancouver. And I'm going to wrap this one up by mentioning a new gang that has been operating in Vancouver recently called Zone 43. This is actually a gang from Montreal, and they are said to have an alliance with the Bloods gang. Recently, the Zone 43 group has been in a violent conflict in Montreal with a rival group called the Prophet Boys, and they've become very well known in that city. The Zone 43 gang established connections with the Wolfpack Alliance in Montreal as that Vancouver gang had expanded across Canada. Zone 43 appeared on Vancouver police radar in 2023, just last year, and they are said to be working with the Wolfpack Alliance to distribute drugs in Vancouver's downtown east side, and they've been linked with at least one shooting in Vancouver so far. Just a couple months ago, in May of this year, Vancouver police arrested 5 members of the Zone 43 gang, and they seized multiple firearms, 24 kilos of illicit drugs, and $150,000 in cash. Maria Morani is a criminologist who has studied Montreal street gangs, and she stated that it was unusual that Zone 43 would be moving into Vancouver, although members of that group have been involved in prostitution in several other Canadian cities. The addition of this new gang has reportedly caused increased tension in Vancouver's downtown east side. They do work with the Wolfpack Alliance, but they have a reputation for violence, and it's definitely an interesting new development in Vancouver's gang situation. And that pretty much wraps up this video. Again, this was part 3 of a 3-part series, so if you got some value out of this one, you might enjoy parts 1 and 2 that I've already posted. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and if you'd like to watch more of my content in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload at least 1 new video per week. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.